Um, I think most of all, what I would want to do is to encourage responsible breeding. So, to whatever way we get to that in terms of methods, but to encourage the breeding of a sustainable number, of healthy horses, who have their best chance of staying sound, who are born with a conformation which will hopefully predispose them to avoid injury rather than to getting injury, animals who have not got inherited problems. So to make use of all of the tools at our disposal, really, to be aiming to breed those healthy animals who will have happy or good lives, for a good period of time rather than just very successful athletes for a couple of years and then, injured.
For this episode, our guest is Professor Madeleine Campbell, who is Professor of Veterinary Ethics at the University of Nottingham. She's also a lifelong horsewoman and a breeder. And in fact, before she went down the veterinary ethics route, she was a specialist in equine reproduction, which is a field that I've spent my life working in, although not at her level. So it's been really interesting for me to see the direction in which she has gone. And it's also interesting that it was questions in her own head about the ethics of horse breeding that brought her to where she is today. If you're a regular subscriber to the podcast, you'll know that we already had a really interesting episode with Maddie where we discussed the ethics of using horses for sport. And I really recommend you check that out if you haven't listened to it. We took advantage of having Maddie in the studio to record a second session, which is this one, and this is on the ethics of horse breeding. Again, a very interesting topic. The ethical aspects of horse breeding probably haven't received the attention they deserve. And in this episode, we talk about the whole spectrum from natural cover, which is what we use in thoroughbred breeding, to the assisted and artificial reproduction techniques that are used in a wide variety of other breeds. I think you'll find it stimulating and worth listening to. In this season 2 of Changing Rein, we've talked a little bit about the Changing Rein Challenge. And I suppose our Changing Rein challenge for you in this episode, particularly if you are a breeder, is that fundamental ethical question: just because I can breed, should I? I have to apologise, there is some soft Irish rain falling, especially in the latter part, but I hope it doesn't detract from your enjoyment of this episode. It's so good to have you here to talk to us a little bit about the ethics of breeding, because obviously it's an area I'm particularly interested in. You spent the early part of your career and you were a recognised specialist in equine reproduction. And of course, without breeding, there would be no horse sport because we provide or we
True.
produce the raw material for the sports we all love. And yet it probably hasn't gotten the attention that other aspects of the world of horses has gotten. I don't know whether they just say, well, everything must be fine in the breeding world, or it often puzzles me why it's not
Mm.
kind of looked at more closely, and maybe that's coming. Is there responsibility on breeders to think a little bit about the ethics of what they're doing,
Yeah.
or should they just merrily go on their way producing the horses that we all love?
Yeah, no, I think there are, and I think there are kind of two levels of responsibility for breeders nowadays. So I think there's an overall responsibility in my mind, whatever kind of horse you're breeding, to be trying to produce a horse which will be healthy and thereby have a high standard of welfare. So, breeding focusing when you're breeding only on a particular thing and ignoring, other conformational traits, for example, or deliberately breeding things that can be surgically fixed. That to my mind is not the way we should be going. We should be trying to produce healthy athletes because that gives them the best chance of having a good standard of welfare, across their lifetime. And that is to a large extent to do with selection of breeding animals. And temperament is part of that as well. When it comes to, we were talking earlier about the kind of psychological domain of welfare, and temperament, selecting for good temperaments is really important as well. I think just not ignoring that just because it happens to be an athletic superstar. And then nowadays there are additional questions that, of course, not so much in your kind of breeding method with thoroughbred racehorses, but in my world of non-thoroughbreds, there are additional questions around techniques as well, and which of those we should use.
Yeah, it's funny because in my thoroughbred world we call it natural service, and I sometimes wonder how natural it actually is. Um, and I suppose
Mm,
there's commercial pressures involved, and there's safety, health and safety concerns. But probably some reflection needed too on some of the techniques that are used. What practical things could breeders do? I suppose, first of all, in my world of natural breeding, and then in your world where these advanced assisted reproductive techniques are used, which come with um, their own questions as well.
sure,
What
sure.
advice can you give to breeders who are concerned or would like to kind of feel that they are doing things as ethically as possible?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. I mean, this was exactly, it was coming up against these kind of questions in my own clinical practice that kind of set me off on getting involved in ethics to start with back in 2012 or so. And you're right, of course, in entirely natural circumstances, horses would be breeding and they would, in an extensive area, and there would be essentially a herd of mares. A stallion would have his harem and he would be constantly interacting with them. And when they're coming into estrus, he would be what we call teasing them to test for their receptivity, and then he would typically be mounting them, actually without getting his penis out, maybe even getting on sideways just to test whether or not they are receptive. And only when that's all been gone through over quite a prolonged period would they actually get on with the breeding. And that, as you say, is very different from the system of so-called natural cover that people, and particularly the thoroughbred racing industry, are using nowadays. And it's a system which has been historically used, of course, when the mare and the stallion are restrained, and we expect it all to happen rather quickly with a minimum of teasing. In fact, we employ teaser stallions or geldings often, and so forth. And as you say, a large part of that is around concerns around safety, particularly when we're dealing with very valuable horses, but also safety of personnel. Um, and it would be nice, wouldn't it, to try and make things as natural as possible for the horses, in terms of fulfilling their welfare needs. But we have to be practical, and we can't be turning out, you know, loads of thoroughbred racehorses into fields for prolonged periods and just kind of letting them get on with it. I don't think that's a practical way of looking at it. So I guess what we have to try and do, and you're probably actually much better able to think about this than I am, because it's the world in which you work all the time, and I do no natural cover in my clinical practice. But we need to be trying to think about how we could at least incorporate elements of what happens naturally, in order to try and reduce stresses or increase positive experiences. So things like perhaps, like how is the foal being restrained while the covering's going on? Is it within sight of the mare? All of those kind of things. Can we allow a little bit more interaction safely between stallion and mare? Is it good to be using teaser stallions, or are they in fact finding it a frustrating experience? And can we mitigate that somehow? And all of those kind of things. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those thoughts, exactly the same thing. What small change? And I have seen changes. I mean, I can remember when I
Mm,
was a child, I grew up on the Irish National Stud, and mares were routinely restrained with hobbles. That
yes,
doesn't
yeah,
happen,
I remember
so
that too.
um we had blindfolds, we had all, different things, and I think back now, I think, gosh, that really was not, it was a real case of just getting the job done. I
Mm,
I think the interaction on the stallion side, I think the interaction between the stallion handler and the stallion is crucial. I think you can see when there's a good relationship between them, that the whole process is much, it just happens in a much
Yes.
calmer and better way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important thing that shouldn't be lost sight of. If there's trust between the two, the stallion and his handler, I think that's a really positive thing. Um,
I agree.
uh,
I agree.
I I would like to think any mare I sent for live cover was, at her peak receptivity. Um, it's not always absolutely guaranteed. Maiden mares, I think in particular, need a lot of, again, careful handling and trust and confidence
Empathy.
building,
Yeah.
and empathy, exactly, just so that because they are they're going to be broodmares for the next 10 or 15 years if all goes well, and so therefore they needs to be a positive experience for them. um I agree with you about the
Yeah, and
foal.
perhaps careful selection of stallions. I mean, the people who are breeding a lot know which stallions are gentle, and maybe they could kind of
Mm-hmm,
direct those
mm-hmm.
maiden mares in
Yeah,
that way for
yes,
the first
yes,
year or two. I
yes,
don't know.
yes. Yeah, 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 yeah.
I think the way we keep stallions is another interesting thing to think about. So,
Mm-hmm,
I've certainly over the years been to many places where they've kind of had this stallion barn, and this isn't just thoroughbred
mm-hmm,
racehorses. This is also warm bloods, and that as we said earlier, is very unnatural. In a natural situation, there would be one senior dominant stallion with his harem of mares. And in fact, on my own stud, purely by chance, before I began thinking about this years ago, we used to have three stallions standing here, and just because of the way the yard is physically divided up, we actually ended up kind of having like one stallion with in the outside stables as mares in, and then one stallion in a barn with mares in, and then the other
mm-hmm,
stallion down the bottom, the other side of the barn of mares. And so effectively, actually, each of them did have kind of their group of mares, and they were really very relaxed. And Dominic Berger's done some very interesting
mm-hmm,
work on this, which has shown really
mm-hmm,
quite conclusively that stallions are much less stressed if you keep them in a group of mares rather than in a barn full of other stallions all
mm-hmm,
kind of competing with each other.
mm-hmm. And then the work they've done about turning out stallions over the summer, I just think that's amazing. I can't see some of our thoroughbred colleagues allowing it or going for it, but I just think okay, I think the first couple of days there's a little bit of argy-bargy, but they seem to settle down, and it seems to work really well. So yeah, I find all that really fascinating. Karen, did you want to?
Oh, I was just going to, you mentioned about like talking about stallions. Like one of the things that I'm curious about, which is shuttle stallions. So you talked about like sustainability and the way we think about the world, and so we've got sort of the individual experience for the horse traveling from one hemisphere to the other. So shuttle stallions are thoroughbred stallions that travel from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere for breeding.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't be saying this because I'm
No.
not the expert, but what could you talk a little bit, Maddie, about sort of the ethics of both
Mm,
the individual experience for the stallion, but also from a climate perspective in terms of sustainability for not only
yeah.
the sport but for all of us.
Yeah, so that is a really nice example, I think, of where kind of animal ethics and environmental ethics intersect. So it was something I've been thinking about for a few years, and Peter Sander and I published a paper quite a long time ago now about kind of welfare issues in equine breeding, and this was one of the things we kind of alighted upon because, of course, any transport, never mind long distance air transport of any animal, including horses, is unavoidably stressful for them and unavoidably puts them at risk of disease, however much we try to mitigate that. That's just the way it is. And the reality is we could actually avoid having to transport those horses at all if we used artificial insemination. So this is where it kind of ties into the question about techniques and the ethical use of assisted reproductive techniques, because actually, with warm bloods, we don't shuttle stallions at all. We simply collect semen from the stallions, freeze it, and transport the semen to the other side of the world, and thereby avoid having to transport the stallions. And at the moment, that is just an industry decision that they haven't yet decided to go that way. My personal view would be that from a welfare, if we're using welfare to inform our ethical decision making, personally, I think it would be ethical to allow the use of artificial insemination in that circumstance. And then how does it tie into the whole issue of sustainability? I was down at the International Society of Equitation Science conference earlier this year in the Southern Hemisphere, and actually there was some good presentations there on sustainability in equestrianism generally, and it's a huge topic. I mean, the amount of plastic we're using in equestrianism, the amount of feed, the energy that's being used to produce that concentrated feed for horses and so forth, all of these things are issues, and certainly long distance transportation of horses is an issue as far as climate change and energy uses goes, and that applies to breeding, but also in fact to the use of horses in sport, which may be something we have to start to think about in the years to come too.
Maddie, I'm really curious. Is there a reason why thoroughbred breeding is so different from the breeding of horses in other equestrian sports in relation to the use of artificial reproduction technology?
Is there a physiological reason? No, absolutely not. I think it's simply been a business decision, and it's been something that has been challenged in the courts in Australia, and was defended as being something which a group of people could just say was the way that they were going to do things, and the concerns that have been expressed by that group of people have been, they were initially, I think, somewhat to do with the ability to accurately identify horses. Well, ever since we've had DNA testing, that's no longer a concern. And then more recently, there's been a voiced concern about the possibility that if we use artificial insemination rather than so-called natural cover, that would result in too many horses being, or too many mares being bred to one stallion. And therefore, that might be from a genetic point of view. And the reason behind that, just to explain, Karen, is that when we do artificial insemination, when we collect the semen from a stallion, typically for most stallions, we get in one collection, which is what would normally go into just one mare, actually enough to get between, say, 4 and 7 mares pregnant. So you kind of quadruple the number of mares you can get pregnant per ejaculation. But to my mind, at least that is it's a nonsense argument against using it, because actually all you have to do at a breed registry level is to limit the number of foals that can be registered per stallion, and or the stallion owner themselves can simply limit the amount of semen they sell to start with. So it doesn't make sense to me.
Could I just want to make sure I've got this clear in my head. So you could get more foals for less effort on the part of the stallion. So that
absolutely,
would be
absolutely, yeah. And I mean, in fact, that is an important welfare point, because we do know that with thoroughbred stallions, very busy, popular thoroughbred stallions, sometimes they're covering 3 mares a day. That's correct, right, Meta?
Oh yeah, 4. Yeah.
And by the end of a busy season, they are probably really quite tired, and I mean, certainly even here, with the non-thoroughbred stallions, when they've been in very busy periods, and it doesn't happen very often with them, we notice a definite drop in libido. They start to just become tired by the whole thing, and yeah, you can absolutely avoid that happening by collecting the semen once a day, and you would have enough to cover 3 mares with one collection or more, for some stallions, many more.
It's a kind of a contradiction, because when I started at a big public stud farm in Ireland, standing thoroughbred stallions, we covered, I think, 40 or 50 mares. Each horse, covered 40 or 50 mares in a season. We didn't cover mares on Sundays. It was just a very simple, different life. Now, the equivalent stallions are probably covering 250 mares, the good stallions. So I know that's not the number that you might be able to do with artificial insemination, but it's still a significant increase. And I don't understand myself personally that why, if that is the concern about the cat, the number of mares that can be bred, why the breed authorities can't just bring in a cap and say we will only register the first
Exactly.
150 foals from that stallion, or the first
Yeah.
200 foals from that stallion. I really don't understand it. From a practical veterinary point of view, the reduction in disease risk, in the danger to the stuff we talked about in the natural cover, that is, or so-called natural cover, that is all eliminated. You can breed from mares who otherwise might not be able to stand for cover. You can breed from stallions who might not otherwise be able to serve a mare naturally. So I live and work in that system. I don't necessarily agree with it. And I think there are ways of changing it that still will serve the purposes, the commercial needs of the people who are involved. But it's not a decision I'm ever going to be privy to or party to. I think it's I used to say it wouldn't happen in my lifetime. I started to think that maybe the change might come.
The other thing that strikes me is if there's a cap on the number of foals from any given stallion that can be registered in that 12-month period, and that cap could be global, is there potentially a commercial benefit for breeders in that you could auction those foals off all around the world? So it actually it's not reliant on the horse being physically in a country at a particular time when a mare happens to be in estrus. You could purchase that straw of semen and impregnate the mare when it works for the mare.
Exactly.
And so potentially you might actually make more money from the stallion. I don't know. Is that?
I guess so. I mean, there are.
Yeah. Sorry. It just struck me that it might actually be a commercial benefit as well as I like, if I can possibly find a win-win, I love a win-win. And it just struck me that maybe that could be a potential win-win.
No, but it is, and I mean, and it's one which non-thoroughbred stallion owners have already, seized with kind of enthusiasm. So, one of the stallions we used to have standing here, Stanhope Stidicoid, I mean, his owner always said, he had foals on all 5 continents, exactly because they'd made use of that possibility.
One of the other arguments that's put forward, Maddie, is the genetic diversity, that we would be making the gene pool more limited because of all these straws. Everyone would gravitate towards the popular stallions, and there'd be loads of straws available from them, and the kind of other less popular horses wouldn't get an opportunity. Is there any merit in that argument?
I mean, I think people gravitate towards the popular stallions anyway. That's why they have the 250 mares a year as opposed to the 40, I suppose, as we were talking about earlier. So no, I don't think that makes.
Can I be a little bit provocative then and say, what's so great about your ARTs? What are the positives from a welfare and ethical point of view, with the procedures that you've been involved in, and I suppose what are the negatives? Because I don't imagine it's going to be the solution to everything. I'm sure there are ethical issues involved. No, I don't think it is
for a moment. No. So, and I should preface everything I'm about to say by making the point that we have a real lack of evidence around the welfare effects of many of these techniques, simply because the studies have never been done. So, on artificial insemination, I think I'd be right in saying, providing it's done properly, all of us who've worked with that over the years are confident that it is not a stressful, welfare negative experience for mares when it's done properly. But actually, there are no published papers proving that, and the same is true of most of the other assisted reproductive techniques as well. So we are largely reliant upon anecdotal evidence from those using the techniques. In the really more advanced techniques, and specifically around cloning, Some of those who've been doing it, and Katrin Hinrichs, Professor Katrin Hinrichs in America, really led the way on this, have been very good about assessing the impacts upon the animals and the foals which have been produced by that way, and publishing that evidence. And she really deserves to be recognised and commended for having done that. But generally speaking, we have a lack of evidence, and so broadly, based on what we do know, in terms of artificial insemination, I think many of the positive potential of it is exactly the kind of thing that we've just been discussing. The fact that you don't have to transport mares and foals, that you're not putting them into new environments, which is stressful for the youngsters as well as for the dams, that you're reducing the biosecurity risk that's associated with moving them all into big groups and so forth, and just being able to inseminate them at home quietly is a less stressful experience for her, almost certainly, than so-called natural cover in the way in which we've described it earlier. On the negative side, sometimes if we're using artificial insemination, it involves more examinations of the mare, and they are in themselves invasive examinations, and sometimes we may be using more drugs and so forth to get her at the point in which we want to order the semen. And that's not necessarily true, because nowadays, even in natural cover system, as you well know, we're aiming really to just cover each mare once each year, and so we're probably using those drugs and doing those examinations anyway. That's the most simple of the assisted reproductive techniques, and then we kind of go through a whole raft of them. So the next most popular one would probably be embryo transfer, and that involves nowadays non-surgical flushing of an embryo from a mare and then transferring it back in to a recipient mare. And again, I think our anecdotal experience of that is it doesn't cause a big welfare issue if it's done properly and with appropriate sedation. And then a definite positive that is associated with being able to flush embryos. And again, this is something that has been developed originally very much in Professor Hinrichs' is actually that we can then biopsy those embryos to look for genetic diseases or to look for abnormalities which would cause real welfare impacting diseases in the foals, and then to select against those embryos. So and obviously if you're just doing natural cover, you don't have that option to kind of look at the embryo in the lab and choose the healthy embryos to use. So that to me is a very good use of assisted reproductive technique. And then there are others like oocyte retrieval, gamete intrafallopian transfer, trying to do IVF in horses, and then cloning, which kind of all become increasingly more invasive, particularly once we're the oocyte retrieval essentially involves kind of sucking the eggs out of the mare's ovary using a large ultrasound guided needle. So that's the point at which personally I begin to worry about whether the kind of benefits really do outweigh the harms, or whether we're at the point at which things are becoming sufficiently harmful to the mare that we should be thinking very hard about whether or not we're doing it.
I wondered, you mentioned recipient mares, so for the benefit of the listeners, they're mares who are they're like the surrogates. They carry the embryos to term. Are there ethical issues around the whole idea of having a band of recipient mares just for that purpose?
Yeah, it's something which I've been asked about, and which people have been thinking about for some years now. My own experience of doing embryo transfer when I was in clinical practice, I was lucky enough to be involved in it, first of all down in Australia, and then doing my own back in the UK, which are two quite different systems, because in Australia there's a lot of space. And so you are able to keep big herds of recipient mares. In this country, it's less common to do that, because we simply don't have as much space. So they tend to be a bit more intensively kept. I mean, from the mare's point of view, if it's a stable herd of mares, that's probably quite a nice natural situation actually for them to be in, rather than being kept individually. From the point of view of how well they get looked after, I think the risks are the same as they are actually for any broodmare population. That there's a risk perhaps that the kind of general health maintenance issues such as foot trimming and dentistry and all of those kind of things get overlooked, and so it's important obviously that they are taken proper care of, routine vaccination and so forth. The way in which it tends to work with embryo recipient mares is they will have an embryo put in them 1 year, and then they will foal, and then they will probably have a winter off before they then get used again as a recipient the following year. And so there's the potential that in that winter off, they may not get thought about as carefully as they should be. Whereas I think the whole time they've got a valuable foal with, inside them, their welfare is most likely being very well catered for. So that to me is the risk period, that kind of overwinter period. Having said that, I've personally seen no evidence of it being a problem. I just think it's something people need to be aware of, that they do think about those mares in that kind of fallow period.
Is there a risk that when we talk about, the welfare of the mares during that we're focusing perhaps only on their health, or are we thinking about their well-being,
Well,
their mental state as well as their health?
yeah, no, I mean, maybe I haven't expressed it very clearly. In my own mind, I am thinking about both. And I think the fact they're
Yeah.
kept in a herd often actually from a psychological welfare point of view is a good thing. They're able to express normal behaviors and to interact with normal social interactions and so forth. So I think, and I completely agree with the point you're making, that health and welfare are obviously not the same thing, but it is nonetheless true that if you're in poor health, your welfare is generally affected. So if, for example, they haven't had their feet trimmed and that therefore, they can't walk comfortably, that is going to be a negative welfare impact. So they do kind of tie into each other. But you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about it more holistically than just health.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because Karen and I had this conversation just last week. I grew up on stud farms. I've lived on stud farms all my life. I'd like to come back as a broodmare. I think they have as horses' lives go, I think they have a very good life. Now I'm lucky. They've been well managed stud farms, and people take great care of them. But they have that chance of social interaction. They're in generally stable social groups. It's not a bad life. So I mean, I'm not a rider. I never had a horse of my own. I haven't had that personal interaction with horses that Karen has had. And I look at the welfare issues that people talk about, and I've had to learn a lot because I didn't see those. I just saw happy mares and happy foals and just a general. Yeah. But I suppose that does bring me on to, there's two issues I think that people talk about in breeding that might also be potential welfare issues. And one would be the weaning process.
I was
And
just thinking,
yeah. And the second would be overproduction, just as and I think you touched on it earlier because you talked about people being sensible and ethical in their decisions to actually breed from their mares. But maybe a little bit about the weaning. I don't know if you'd like to
yeah.
give us your views on that.
But I think it's a really important area, and it's one that has really only begun to be thought about fairly recently, isn't it? And actually, there's some good research been going on around the kind of most welfare-friendly method of weaning mares at Nottingham University, and there'll be papers coming out from that soon. So yeah, it's certainly something. It's one of those things we talked about earlier about the fact we need to challenge ourselves, and I think we all need to be thinking about the way in which we're weaning, and perhaps not to do it in some of the ways that we historically have done. And I mean, Gemma Pearson has talked interestingly about this as well, and the fact that in her view it ought to be rather later than we historically have done it, and so forth. So that's definitely an area of active research, and I suspect that all of us will be adapting our habits accordingly, as we go through the next few years, and we understand more and more. I think that the way in the foal's experience as it is weaned will have an ongoing impact on that foal's resilience, and as it becomes an adult horse. So that's also interesting area to think about, isn't it?
Do you want to, just for people who aren't breeders, explain perhaps how traditionally foals might have been weaned and what perhaps some of the new research is showing as might be better alternatives?
Well, one of the
Do you want to
old ways
talk
would
to
be
that a bit,
just,
Meta?
lock the mare up in the stable. You know, the mares and foals going out to the paddock and lock the mare up in the stable and turn the foal out, or turn a group of foals out, leave the mothers behind, uh, move the mares to the other end of the farm. A lot of distress, a lot of shouting and roaring, and really, really difficult for the foals and for the mares. I think sometimes think, Maddie, we forget about the mares in this process. People have focused on,
It's awful. I
yeah,
agree.
people focus on the well-being of the foals, and I can see why, because it has such an impact on their future, their just how they live their lives. But mares, I just don't know if people think enough about it. Um, there are other methods. I mean, the one we use, and again, we may change this, but what has worked for us in the last couple of years is that we introduce a older barren mare to the group of mares and foals. So she becomes a kind of an extra adult in the group. And over a period of about a week, we then take a mare away every day or two until there's only the nanny mare left. And she stays with them right the way through until the following April or May. So when they're yearlings, she's still with them. And we have found it has made for a much happier, more content bunch of young stock. They really are. They're just easier to be around. It has definitely improved things for us. So, that's our current method. And as yes, Maddie says, we may adjust that depending. We are commercial foal sellers, so there's a little bit of a time element to it, in that we need to have them weaned so that we can then prepare them for sale. So we can't leave it as long as maybe we should. We do make sure that they're well used to creep feed in the 3 or 4 weeks before they're weaned, and we don't just have a set date. We don't say, okay, we're going to start on the whatever 15th of August, whatever it might be. We do look at them as in terms of their age and how mature, how forward they are. We try to take a holistic view of the process.
Hmm. So, Maddie, what age do I think you mentioned briefly that you might, like the science might be reviewing the age at which foals are weaned. I think you mentioned Gemma
That's
Pearson's
my
work.
understanding of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, because traditionally we have tended to wean about 5, 6 months, haven't we, Nashwin? And I think my understanding from what I've heard at conferences so far is that probably ought to be pushed further out. And I mean, in the natural situation, if we look at that, obviously foals would be drinking less and less as the year went on, but typically they would often kind of hang around with the mares until the next foal is born. So that's the best part of the year, naturally.
I think some of the debate is around how much of their association with the mare is nutritional, which actually is probably not very much at all, and how much of it is just
Exactly,
the
exactly.
social bond.
Social.
So,
Yeah,
um, and
yeah,
how important that is. But it's fascinating to watch, because
yeah.
month-old foals, already are spending a lot of time away from their dams and interacting with
Yes.
other foals
Yeah.
in the paddock. It is really fascinating to watch how they're just like toddlers, children. The clingy 2-year-old becomes 3-year-old that you can't keep up with, because they just run
Yeah.
everywhere. So it's kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing. Mm.
But they sure show their true colours if they can't see mum, don't they? Even though they might be bold and
Yeah,
off
yeah, yeah,
socializing,
yeah, yeah. But
but if mum
yeah.
disappears, their
Mm.
demeanor changes, doesn't it?
But again, like so many things in this world of horses, like so many things, there are individual differences. Some foals just don't
Mm.
seem
Yeah,
to care.
absolutely.
They just, they're off doing
Yeah.
their own thing, and others are quite, clingy. Again, like children, some of them are, they will explore Africa, and others will just stay, by mommy's side. So yeah, it is fun, and I think we talk a lot about horses, and we don't talk enough about the individual. We're great at these blanket statements, but actually there's a lot of individuality there too, in how they respond to what we're doing with them.
There
So
absolutely is. I completely
mhm.
agree. And I think all of those of us who work with horses, we kind of know that, but we maybe forget to say it. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and the dams, I mean, they're very different themselves, aren't they, in the
Yes.
way in which they
Yes.
interact with the foals. And
Yes.
some of them are quite kind of strict mothers,
Yes.
and some of
Yes.
them, particularly
Yes.
with colt foals, we've had to just
Yes.
let them
Yes.
climb all over
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
different.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Meta usually asks this question, but I'm going to ask it today. We talk about our sort of changing rain genie, and if you could do anything, what would you do, kind of thing. So, in the world of breeding, Maddie, if there was sort of one thing you could do, or
Oh,
what might it be? Like, what would you? There were no impediments for cost, or no impediments. You've got free reign.
yeah. I mean, I think actually to go to the question we didn't quite get to that was asked about numbers of horses being kind of over breeding. Um, I think most of all, what I would want to do is to encourage responsible breeding. So, to whatever way we get to that in terms of methods, but to encourage the breeding of a sustainable number of healthy horses, who have their best chance of staying sound, who are born with a conformation which will hopefully predispose them to avoid injury rather than to getting injury, animals who have not got inherited problems. So to make use of all of the tools at our disposal, really, to be aiming to breed those healthy animals who will have happy or good lives, for a good period of time, rather than just very successful athletes for a couple of years and then, injured.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I wonder sometimes, I think there's probably two approaches. One is the throw enough muck at the wall and some of it will stick. If you breed enough mares, you might breed a champion. Um, and that's the problematic approach, obviously. But in any
Yeah.
discipline, whether it's racing or show jumping or eventing, there are always going to be champions, and there's also going to be the horses who don't make it. So I suppose what you're saying is you can increase your chances of having a horse who is successful um, by being selective. Does that mean that we are raising the bar for the average? Are we trying to produce a better cohort of eventers or show jumpers or racehorses because we're being selective? Will that help
But
raise the bar?
well, I think it ought to, but what we ought to be trying to do is to like raise the bar of health and associated good welfare opportunities, I suppose, because then, it's. I mean, I've had this conversation about greyhounds actually. That there's only one greyhound that's going to run and win the Greyhound Derby every year.
Hmm.
But of course, what everyone's trying to do, just like
Hmm.
they're trying to breed the Derby winning horse, is breed the Derby winning greyhound. But actually many greyhound owners, and I'm supposing it's the same is true of many racehorse owners, what they really want to be able to do is to go and watch their horse or greyhound run often, and for it to remain uninjured, so that they can go and have a nice day or a nice night out and enjoy that interaction, and for the animal to stay healthy and well. And so if what we aim at is to be breeding conformationally sound, healthy animals, whatever species they are, then hopefully that will fulfill that, and will mean that even those who don't win, can have good lives, and
Hmm.
that may
Hmm.
be actually not as even as competitors.
Hmm.
As
But
I
that.
remember the Princess Royal saying years ago at a, I think it was at one of the National Equine Forums, and we were talking about breeding horses, and she kind of said, but actually what we need to be breeding is the kind of all-round horse that three members of the family can ride. And she's absolutely right. And I was talking to a friend today who's been trying to find a horse for her teenage daughter. We all know how difficult those are to find. So what we should be trying to do is to breed horses so even if they don't make it, to that elite level as competitors, will be able to have another use, which will be a positive welfare experience for them and for the people who interact with them.
And you would hope that a byproduct of breeding these sound healthy horses is that there's reduced injuries, which is better for,
Exactly.
that's what the public want to see. That's one of their big concerns. So we have a healthier population of horses who stay sound and compete for longer, give that joy and that pleasure to people. So it's actually a win-win. Which you said,
It's a
Karen, you always
win-win.
want.
And of course, absolutely. And of course, it's not just the public who want to see a reduced level of injury. I mean, this is something I've said to lots of people recently, is like no one involved with a horse or a greyhound
No.
or a sled dog or whatever wants that animal to get injured when it goes out to compete. It is the last thing everyone involved with them wants to happen. So, so everyone will be thrilled if we can continue to drive down injury rates. And that's what we have to keep trying to do. And to go back to our earlier conversation about using animals in sport and the ethical framework for doing so, we have to be constantly researching the causes of injuries so that we can better understand how we mitigate them and thereby make what are currently unavoidable injuries avoidable in future.
Well, I think that's a really positive note on which to wrap up this episode, because you've given what, as I say, what Karen loves, which is a win-win, and that's a big thing in the changing rein tent. We love a win-win.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Maddie. I've really enjoyed our conversation and really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy day.
No, thank you. It's been lovely having a chat with both of you, and I feel like we could have carried on talking for hours longer, but it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for the opportunity.